Good evening, Bern, and welcome to the Lodge Hope of Karachi, number 337, and our 64th lockdown lecture. Bern, it's not been the best of Mays weather-wise, but the weatherman, Sean, told me this evening that we're coming to the good weather coming into the end of May and the beginning of June. But you always get a warm welcome here on a Tuesday evening at the Lodge Hope of Karachi. And it's a great pleasure this evening to have a returning speaker in Brother Moises Gomez. However, before I reintroduce Moises to you all, can I remind you all of the Grand Lodge of Scotland guidelines in terms of Zoom meetings? Please keep your video running and a recognisable name in the little square box for me. If you do have any challenges with your bandwidth, just please drop me a little message. Please can I ask you to sign our virtual tile on our Facebook pages, Bern? Thank you so much. As ever, questions will be in the chat later on, Bern, and we will pose them to Moises. I am sure we're going to have a very interesting evening. I was saying to Moises on the messenger when we were setting this up that Cuba is certainly on my holiday bucket list at some point in the future. And with that, it gives me the greatest pleasure to reintroduce you all to Brother Moises Gomez, the Grand Historian of the Grand Lodge of New Jersey. He's a member of Atlas Pythagoras Lodge number 10. And you're all impressed that I was able to read it off my screen and not use my notes, Brian. And Moises, at this point, can I thank you for taking the time out of your busy day, because I know that you're at work on the bridge when you're speaking to us. So it's very much appreciated. The virtual floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, brother. Brethren, welcome all, and thank you for the opportunity again to present. I'm coming to you live from the George Washington Bridge here in New York City, where I'm stationed. And I was able to take an hour or so off to have some fellowship with you all here. The lecture tonight deals with a very important topic and country of mine, since my parents were born and raised in Cuba. They immigrated here in the 50s, but Cuba is a big part of my life. And I found it very interesting on how the Masons in Cuba have been able to maintain themselves through many centuries of oppression and battles and revolutions and independences, and even through communist regime, which we're going to get into a little bit now. Now, Cuba was a very important post of the Spaniards. Of course, we all know that Christopher Columbus landed here and made contact with many natives in this land as he was trying to find the Indian side of the world, and came across the Caribbean and North American continent here, which was in between. But Cuba has been a long standing predominant Hispanic realm for the Spanish crown up until the War of 1898, when the United States intervened and we acquired Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, then of course giving Cuba its independence. Philippines has their independence, and Cuba still, Puerto Rico still belongs a Commonwealth of territory of the United States. But again, it played a very important role, depending on how you look at it. But Havana was considered the Viceroy of Havana was considered second in most powerful position outside of the King and Queen of Spain, because of the amount of wealth that was coming through the Caribbean, South America, Central America, and the lower parts of North America. As you know, well aware, sugar and tobacco and rum and gold and silver, of course, were mainstay of the day, and this was a bountiful place to have all this. Of course, Cuba has gone through many turmoils. It was once, for a short time, in the hands of the British Empire, and it was reverted back to Spaniard control. But here are one of the oldest known maps drawings of the island of Cuba, and the other map is one of the first maps depicting the newly created Cuban flag, which we'll get into a little bit later on, because it was actually created here in the United States. Now, the earliest known Masonic lodges in Cuba, there were some earlier, which I'm actually tracing down now. There were some Haitian and French lodges that came over from Haiti, which is to our eastern borders. They actually came here in the late 1700s. But again, in 1752, I should say 1762, when the British took over and had dominion over Cuba for a short time, a Irish regimental military lodge had number 218 actually worked and operated here in a monastery, which was converted into offices for that regiment, and they held court there. There's actually some writings here from one of the only known writings, minutes that we have from that time period, signed by the warden's master and secretary of the lodge. So this is one of the earliest known operating lodges, although they did not make any Masons. They didn't have power to make Masons. There was just a traveling military lodge. And they did travel on extensively from Canada, North America, United States, what it is now. But they were in Cuba, pre-Revolutionary War here in America. They were there. And again, they were one of the earliest known lodges to actually operate in Cuba. There's not much known. I did reach out to the Grand Lodge of Ireland. I was able to track down the actual patent and the charter of that lodge when it was in Cuba. And they did give me roughly some names of some individuals who were members of the regiment while they were there, but not much was occurring, or did they do much while they were there. Now, Freemasonry in Cuba has had a tragic and violent past, as this small island nation has had before. And it's been pulled around by many Masonic jurisdictions, including English, Irish, the Grand Lodge of Orient of France. And we had many grand jurisdictions here in the United States that also played a part in forming Masonry in Cuba. But the first official lodge that was chartered was on December 17, 1804, by the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania at a Havana lodge called the Temple of the Theological Virtues, number 103. And Joseph Cernu was his actual first master. Now, he is a Frenchman who had a big part with the Scottish Rite. He actually created a schism in the Scottish Rite when he came here to the United States. But for a short time, he found himself a home in Cuba and decided to charter this lodge, asked for permission to charter the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania. And they did charter this lodge. That warrant is still in the hands of the Cuban Grand Lodge. And shortly after, about 6 months or so later, he was actually expelled by the Spanish from Cuba, and then went on through Haiti, and then eventually landed here on the shores of America, where he proceeded to cause a lot of havoc with the Scottish Rite here in the United States. And again, I had no idea that such an infamous individual and prominent member of the craft, depending how you look at it, who was conferring the Scottish Rite degrees at will, had a big part with this lodge in Cuba, which actually went on to become one of the first known times where a Masonic lodge was actually part of a conspiracy to actually overthrow a government. Now, we all like to think, brethren, that Masonic, especially here in America, that Masons had the Freemasonry Society had a hand in the Revolutionary War, or in many other instances around the world. But there's certainly not true. We know that Freemasons did participate. However, as a Masonic fraternity as a whole, it's not really true that it actually happened. But in Cuba, we find this to be the opposite. This lodge was actually very active in the pursuits of freedom and dominion from the Spanish rule. Now, here is the original charter that was granted by the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania. When I traveled to Cuba, it is still in a glass display, and it is still in pretty good condition, considering it's about 200 years, a little over 200 years old. So it's in definitely in good condition. And it is one of their pride and joy of their documents they have there, since this was really the first lodge that actually actively worked as a lodge in Cuba. Now, Cuban wars of independence, persecution, and oppression have been going on for over 200 years. But there is definitely no doubt about it that Cuba and the Masons had played an integral part in this aspect throughout many of the battles and many of the wars for independence that have been fought, especially during the 1800s. There was quite a few, some smaller, some on a major scale, that led up to the 1898 war with Spain, where the United States also interceded and liberated that country from Spanish dominion. Now, the Great Masonic Conspiracy, as I like to call it, was actually true, because this was a conspiracy created by some of the brethren from that lodge, and it originated in this lodge. There's no doubt, and there's proof that the brethren in this lodge participated in 1810 for the first coup to overthrow the Spanish dominion as it was back then. Of course, it didn't work out. It didn't pan out, as many other battles that would ensue in many decades later. But this was definitely organized, orchestrated in a Masonic lodge, in this lodge that was chartered in 1804. And many of the brethren that were a part of it also were great friends with other Masonic revolutionary leaders like Simon Bolivar, Francisco de Miranda, Tristan Louverture, who led the Haitian Revolt in the late 1790s, and of course, the other two individuals leading their respective results in Venezuela and South America. So these individuals played a big hand and a big part, in particular with Joaquin Infante, and of course, Joseph Cernu, who was the sitting worshipful master of this lodge. But these individuals actually started to conspire, and the first Cuban constitution was actually written at this time, although it wouldn't be introduced and it wouldn't be actually enforced and put into law until the ending of the War of 1898, when it was actually used. But actually, the wording and the constitution written would later be used after the 1898 war with the Spanish, when Cuba became an independent nation and imposed and implied those laws and those constitutions that were written about 100 years ago. Now, during this uprising, which was called, like I said, the Great Masonic Conspiracy, many of the individuals that were fighting for liberty were also fighting for the ending of the Civil War, the slavery and oppression, and their own little civil war they had there during 1810. And there was, they wanted to take it one step further, the American Revolution. Many of these individuals were inspired by our revolution here, but they felt that it had not gone all the way, that we actually created a nation, free and independent nation, where all men are created equal. But we know that wasn't the truth here right away, as slavery continued for another 70-odd some years until the ending of the Civil War. But in Cuba, these individuals decided to implement that this was going to be not just a cause for liberation from oppression and dictatorship or monarchical rule, but also to free themselves from the tyrannies of slavery. Now, they did have an individual named Jose Antonio Apante, who is a Rite Creole. And this individual actually was brought in to bring together all the Creoles and Black Cubans in Cuba under slavery together to fight in this battle to eventually rid themselves of monarchical rule and slavery. Unfortunately, again, this was a short-lived battle. I mean, it was up against one of the most powerful countries like British Empire, and it didn't fan well for them. And many of the individuals who were orchestrating this event were arrested, and many were put to death, including Brother Jose Antonio Apante, who was beheaded, and his head was on display in a cage on a particular corner in Havana. And it is believed that the corner where this individual was martyred is the actual corner where the Grand Lodge building of Havana currently sits. And if you go there, and I'll show you pictures later, there is a plaque honoring and commemorating this event that happened here. So apparently, on that corner of the building, this individual was beheaded. This brother was beheaded and put on display. And then guess when years later, when they built the Grand Lodge Temple in Havana, Cuba, they built it on or near the spot where this incident happened. This brother was martyred. Now, this picture here has many individual leaders of Cuba. There were known men throughout the history of that 100-year period, from the early 1800s to the turn of the century. All these individuals were Masons, whether it was the individual who created the flag, Narciso Lopez, Tomás Estrada Palma was the first elected president, Perucho Figueroa was the individual who created the national anthem, Jose Marti is considered the father of the Cuban people in the Cuban country. And again, these were all individuals, but they were all Freemasons as well. Ardent Freemasons who conspired in Masonic lodges to formulate and overthrow the Spanish dominion and Spanish rule. And the picture on the left there, I'm still trying to debate where that exactly the name of the lodge, but that's supposedly taken in front of a place that was meeting as a lodge. And these brethren were out there taking a group picture after they had just come out of a meeting to formulate the next strategy for the big 10-year war, which started in 1868 in Cuba. Now, Freemasons have always been behind the quest of freeing Cuba and have played a big part, in particular these two individuals here, Jose Maria Herrera and Jose Francisco Limes. Now, these individuals, along with Ramon de la Luz, another Mason, actually created an organization in Cuba, Los Soles, And this organization was named later on Reyes y Soles de Bolivar, the light and sun rays of Bolivar, in honor of Simon Bolivar, the leader of the South American cause and revolution. And again, this was a few years after the first attempt in 1810. And in 1822, they start collaborating together to formulate this organization. They actually created a flag. They created a system similar to how lodge meetings meet. And you rose in rank by depending how many people you brought in. And these members were not just becoming members, but they were also becoming soldiers fighting for this independence here as well. And again, these men were very instrumental in the orchestrating and formulating this first quest for independence, which was very hot during the 1810 and 1820s in Cuba. Of course, they didn't lead much, but again, this formulated many more quests for independences later on in the 50s, 60s, and then the final one in 1898. Now, the formation of the Grand Lodge in Cuba was created by the Grand Lodge of South Carolina, and that was first created December 5th, 1859. It was then known as Grand Lodge of Colón, or Columbus, in honor of Christopher Columbus, in order to conceal its Masonic practices established on the island. Now, the first three lodges that were formulated or created were La Fraternidad number 1, Prudencia number 2, y San Andrés number 3, all created on December 27th, 1859. And Masonry has been continuously active under this Grand Lodge, and this Grand Lodge has been continually active from this point up until the present day today without any interruption. They may have decreased in numbers, they may have gone underground, but they have always been a formidable force to be reckoned with in the island of Cuba. Now, today, there are about 322 Masonic lodges in Cuba with about 25,000 members, and that is quite a bit considering that we have twice as many lodges as New Jersey and about 10,000 more members than we have here. They are broken up into 16 provinces, each with a district deputy Grand Master, and there are many districts within each province. There are about 100 districts within those provinces as well. So there's very similar to the provincial Grand Lodges in Scotland, where each province has its own governing body, and then there are subordinate districts under them as well. Now, most of the lodges in Cuba operate in the Scotch Rite, but there are 4 lodges which use the York Rite. All total is 116 lodges in Havana, and this is pretty current, as I spoke to the Grandmaster a few months ago, and we actually went over some numbers to make sure I was kind of clear on this. Now, the lodges in Cuba are very unique in how they operate. They meet every single week of the year with the exception of 2 weeks. The Liberation, their Independence Week, which is just passed in May, which was the birth of their independence in 1898, and of course the holiday week of Christmas in December. But other than that, they operate 50 weeks out of the year. However, they do things a little differently there. Every month, a week is designated for a particular purpose. One meeting would be for degrees, one meeting would be for business, one would be for programs and educational events, and the 4th meeting is for benevolence. And this they do every month. So they don't normally meet the way the conventional lodges do, like our lodges here in Scotland meet, where you do you open, you do business, you have a degree, you have an education, but every meeting is its own independent meeting. Here, they prescribe those meetings as one in particular for every week for that month. Now, this is the original patent that was granted and chartered by the Grand Lodge of South Carolina, the Grand Lodge of Colón, as it was called at that time, which granted the first 3 lodges in Cuba. And later on, of course, it's changed to the Grand Lodge of Cuba. But this is the original patent. It has seen some better times and is quite brittle and quite in disrepair there, but it's still in their care and is still able to see it under a glass case. Now, in Cuba, their 2 biggest, strongest bodies are Craft Lodge and the Scottish Rite. Now, we know the Scottish Rite in Scotland is a purely invitational body. Here in the United States, it's open to all members in good standing in a Craft Lodge to join. And in Cuba, it's similar to both. It is technically open to everybody, but however, it's a very prestigious group to belong to. The Scottish Rite has been in Cuba for quite a long time, and they played a big part in the upheavals of the Scottish Rite coming from Europe through the Caribbean and then settling in Charleston, South Carolina, which gave way and birth to the first Grand Supreme Council ever in 1801. Now, they weren't big on many other independent bodies, but after the final Battle of Independence, they did bring in the Commandery. They did have Royal Arch. They did have other institutions there. But currently, right now, the only two Masonic bodies that operate are the Craft Lodge and Scottish Rite, and they are both very, very, very strong. The Scottish Rite has been very strong in Cuba as the Craft Lodge, and it survived all these many decades up until now, and it still exists to this day. Now, there are Daughters of Acacia, and Daughters of Acacia are similar to the Eastern Star, and they're kind of the same way. Even though Cuba did have Order of the Eastern Star, they have this group now, which is working in Cuba. They have 16 of these lodges that do exist, and they wear white clothes, and it's open to the ladies affiliated with Masonry. They pretty much run the same way, and at their height, during the middle part of the 1950s, they actually started spreading into Central and South America. Of course, when Castro took over, this kind of waned by the side and kind of disappeared for a while, but it's still in existence to this day. Now, the other really important group is the Association of Veterans Masons of Cuba. Now, this is a little misleading because it has nothing to do with veterans of any particular war or battle. By what they mean, veterans mean you're a veteran Mason, which means you have served the craft for over 20 years of uninterrupted activity and service to the craft. Upon their election, you can be invited to join this group, and it's a very, very prestigious group. It's been around for quite some time now, but this group still exists to this day. It's still a very powerful group, and it has very predominant Masons there who have given a lifetime of service to the craft. Now, just to give you an idea of how important they in high esteem they hold this position, that when the Grand Lodge of Cuba meets during their session, they're the only brothers who are received standing are the Sovereign Grand Commander of the Scottish Rite for the Republic of Cuba and the Grand Dean of the Meritorious Association of the Veterans of Masons. So again, it's a very prestigious order, but it has nothing to do with any warlike veteran or battle, strictly a veteran of the Masonic craft. There's also a young group for young men, like we have here in the United States, DMLA. They call it, as the Grandmaster with his broken English was telling me, they call them youngins, for youngsters. And they're trying to bring DMLA into Cuba. They are trying to actively work to bring Royal Arch into Cuba. But the youngins is a group of individual young men of teenage before they become Masons. And it's hoping that they're trying to frame it in the same way as DMLA, trying to educate and foster goodwill with these young men, rear them up correctly, teach them and educate them in many facets of life, leadership roles, speaking roles, managerial roles, and eventually hoping that they will join the craft and become Masons eventually. But it is, when I spoke to the Grandmaster, his intention and the Grand Lodge's intention to eventually bring some of these independent bodies back to Cuba. Now, the Grand Lodge Cuba does operate a Masonic home, as many other grand jurisdictions have. And this has been around since the late 1800s when it was formulated. And now, the only difference is some jurisdictions, their home, like here in New Jersey, were kind of created to help the widows and orphans. And those Masons who were indigent and couldn't afford, for whatever reason, to live on their own, they can come here in their waning age of their years, elderly years, to come here and be able to have a place to stay. In particular, if you were an invalid, or you were disabled, or you were sick, you can get the kind of care that you would get in the hospital, but you can get it here. Well, this Masonic home in Cuba was similar to that, with the exception that they didn't intend for you to be here forever. This was really helped the homeless and helped those orphans and widows and brethren who were destitute or who fell on bad times. They would bring you in, they would house you in little houses called casitas, which means cottages in Spanish. And if you were a family unit, they would have these small units where you can bring your family in, 2 to 3 people, sometimes 4. And here it was meant for you to be able to get back on your feet. And once you got on your feet, it was intended for you to eventually introduce you into society again as a productive member of society and the community, in particular as a productive member of the Masonic order. Now, during the early 2000s, of course, the home had been through some disrepair over the years, especially during the rise of the communist years. Money was very tight. Money was very scarce. So it kind of fell in disrepair and had to be shut down. However, they have since opened it up. And this home is operating again. And it has about 100 or so individuals in there. And again, they're slowly but surely pumping money into it. They're restoring it. And eventually hoping that as the country slowly opens up and more money trickles in, that better jobs and better infrastructure and better trade with other countries around the world can increase the standard and the standard of living in Cuba. And eventually this home could be once operated the way it did back in the 1800s. Now, they also have an Academy of Higher Masonic Studies. And this is similar to an educational symposium we may have here. They do this, and they're very proud about this. And this was something that started in the 1930s to bring education and discussions held within the craft of masonry. And again, this is something that has gone through some tough times, especially during the rise of the communist years. But nevertheless, it was still there, sometimes on the ground, but is now making its way back very strong. And they're encouraging every district to have these higher studies of Masonic higher education and academies to be able to provide educational programs as we're doing here today with the brethren. And it's hoping that as more and more the country falls into the technology age, that they will be able to have Zoom meetings like this and be able to have brethren from around the world present as we're doing here as well, to exchange Masonic fellowship and Masonic education with brethren around the world. Now, in 1955, the Cuban Grand Lodge of Cuba decided to finally open the doors to its museum and library, which they've been trying to do for many, many decades before. But with the onset of this new building in downtown Havana, which is one of the prettiest buildings in Havana. It's a very big Grand Lodge building. It's about, I think it's 11 stories tall. It encompasses an entire city block. And at one point, it was the tallest building in Havana, Cuba. But this building is a very proud place, not only because apparently martyrs were executed, Masonic martyrs were executed on where this building once stands now, many, many years ago, but it's a source of their pride and heritage of what they actually have accomplished in 200 years. Now that it is open on a regular basis, Monday through Friday, usually between the afternoon hours, if they can get brethren to come and man it, as they on their own time. Of course, like all communist countries, when Fidel Castro took over, he took over all of property and seized in Cuba, and this building, of course, fell also under the control of the communist Cuban government, and they had to allow the Cuban government to have offices and rooms on this. So the first 2 floors belong to the Grand Lodge, and then the middle floors belong to the government of Cuba. And then the upper floors, which incorporate the Grand Lodge offices, the museum, and the Great Grand Lodge room, are still in the hands of the Masonic Grand Lodge. Of course, it is their building, but as any communist country, you really don't own the building. But they've kind of left this building alone and not really implied any other rules. They do have a few offices there now, but again, money's tight. The situation there is a little bit rough. And the brethren are having to do what the best they can with the small amount of funds that they have. But it's amazing what they've been able to accomplish and how they've been able to maintain this building even through those dark years of the communist rule there in Cuba. As I said before, appendant bodies did reign in Cuba. We did have Eastern Star, we did have Royal Arch, we did have the Commandery. We had many like we have here, but they all went by the wayside, especially at the onset of the Castro regime in 1959, and they have not come back. So right now, the 2 strongest are the Craft Lodge and the Scottish Rite, which are the 2 most active and are the 2 oldest, which have been there since the early 1800s. Now, Freemasonry in Cuba has touched every aspect of Cuban life, whether it's for the causes for oppression, of slavery, or imperial rule, whether it was designing the Cuban flag, which was designed by a brother here in New York, a Cuban brother in New York. And then for many years, I actually viewed the Cuban flag and never realized that if you turn the flag upright, it actually becomes a Masonic apron. And that was what it is intent. The Masonic, the flag of Cuba was designed with Masonic motifs. all very integral in it, but it was designed under that design of a Masonic apron. So, and I never knew this until it was actually saw a picture of it uprighted as a triangular apron there. As you see, it is in the shape of a Master Mason's apron. Now, the interesting part is that the Cuban flag was actually designed in Cuba, in the United States here in New York City. And it first flew on a building on Nassau and Folsom Street down in Lower Manhattan on May 11th, 1850. So the first time that this flag was flown was actually over a newspaper publishing company called The Sun. It flew for the first time there, which was very odd. Many people were inquiring as to why this particular strange new flag was flying over this building. But the flag was created, it was designed, it was created, it was sewn and put together in New York City on 3 various locations. And then it was flown for the first time on the roof of the Sun building. And the newspaper actually had to take an article out calling attention of its readers to the strange flag high above the flag of free Cuba. There is a flag which will sooner or later float over the Morro Castle, which was the castle in the entrance to the port of Havana. And eventually it did. 8 days later, on May 19th, 1850, it flew for the first time on Cuban soil when Brother Narciso Lopez, who was the creator of this flag, took it with him as a battle flag as he landed in Cardenas, Cuba, on one of the smaller skirmishes that they had against the Spanish Dominion. Now, the Cuban flag has inspired many other nations, and they're in war of independence as well. The Puerto Rican flag and the Cuban flag are a spitting image of each other, except the triangle for Cuba is red, and in Puerto Rico it is blue. Now, Puerto Rico has had a long-standing relationship, in particular with Freemasonry, in particular during this time, these upheavals here in the 1800s with Cuba, and many Cuban patriots and compatriots actually helped fight and foster the rise of independence for Puerto Rico as well. The flag of the Philippines was also inspired by the Cuban flag, as was the Catalan flag of the Catalan separatists, which was a section which still exists to this day. Its home seat is Barcelona, and if many of you don't know, that portion of the northeastern part of Spain, where Barcelona sits, has been trying to separate themselves from Spain and create their own nation of the Catalan nation as well. Of course, it's never come to fruition, but the flag they created was based off the Cuban flag, where they were also seeking their independence from the Spanish Dominion and the Spanish government. So again, we see flags from other nations and in their battles as well. Now, each individual revolutionist that led these 3 and many others were all Freemasons. In particular, the father of Philippine Mason, Brother Rizal, and Brother Betances of Puerto Rico. They were the key leaders of these movements in these revolutionary periods during their time. And of course, we all know the Philippines is a very Masonic country, especially here in the United States. We have many Philippine brethren who are very devoted to that craft. And also in Philippines, the Masonic community, Masonic Freemasonry itself has been interwoven into the causes of freedom and independence in the Philippines, for the Philippine people as well. If you notice, the president, Manny Pacquiao, the famous boxer, just became an apprentice, and usually most of the presidents of Philippines and many of their higher top leaders in government are also members of the craft as well. Now, the Cuban national anthem is a very special anthem, and it was created by Pedro Felipe Figueredo, and he was another revolutionary leader and freedom fighter, and he was fought in the 10 Years' War, which started from 1868 to 1878. And he wrote the Cuban national anthem and Himno de Bayamo in 1867. He was captured during the war and executed on August 17th, 1870. His daughter, Candelaria Figueroa, became a hero of the uprising by carrying the new independent Cuban flag into the Battle of Bayamo in 1868, beginning the 10 Years' War. And they were singing the song, the Cuban national anthem, along with the flag. Now, what's interesting about this individual is that we have a Spanish-speaking lodge here in New Jersey, which was chartered with Perucho Figueroa, and it is now an active lodge here in the Grand Lodge of New Jersey. Now, we did have many Spanish-speaking brethren during this time here in the middle of the 1800s, as many of these immigrants were coming here to the United States to seek assistance from other Masons, to seek assistance in financial means, to buy arms, to raise awareness and support, and also to acquire ships to be able to take them down to Cuba to begin these battles. So many of these wars were actually effectively started here as well, as they were seeking help from our brethren here in the United States as well. Now, during this time, we did have French-speaking lodges, Spanish-speaking lodges. We had German-speaking lodges here in New Jersey, which were granted by the Grand Lodge of New Jersey, and they were able to operate and do their opening and closing of degrees in their native tongue, providing that they communicated with the Grand Lodge in English. Now, of course, over the years and over the century, most of this has gone by the wayside, and we had none, but there was nothing written in our Constitution that said that we could not do it again. So in 2018, my third year as Grand Historian, Most Worshipful Roger Quintana became Grandmaster. He became the first Hispanic Grandmaster. He was native born of Cuba. He was the first Hispanic Grandmaster we had here in Grand Lodge, New Jersey. And many of these Cuban exiles who fled during the revolutionary period of Castro brought Masonry with them to New Jersey and Florida and New York City. However, they didn't integrate with the Grand Lodges or the jurisdictions existing at that time. They just operated quietly by themselves, trying to keep their heritage and their lineage with the Grand Lodge of Cuba. And what happened was the Grandmaster reached out to many of these individuals and decided, why don't you join our Grand Lodge and we'll let you continue operate in your native tongue. So after much debate, after about 2-year debate, our Grandmaster here chartered 5 Spanish lodges and 1 Portuguese lodge, and they're currently working on an Italian lodge to Greek. So one of the lodges was named after this individual who was the father of the Cuban national anthem and a martyr, a Freemason martyr in the second largest battle of independence in Cuba in 1868. Now, the United States has had a keen interest in Cuba ever since the early 1800s with Thomas Jefferson, our third president here. So every president since him, up until the turn of the century, has had an interest and a key interest in obtaining or dealing or even annexing Cuba. Right on from early on, Thomas Jefferson and many presidents after him were seeking the annexation of Cuba, not by occupation, but literally buy it from Spain, as we bought many portions of our country here from the Russians and the French and the Spanish as well. So they really sought to buy from Spain. However, Spain refused to let go of Cuba. But our president here, Masonic President Theodore Roosevelt, fought in the Spanish-American War, making himself a name for himself with his Rough Riders charging up San Juan Hill. Later on, of course, he had interactions with Cuba when he became vice president and then president. Orville Platt came out with the Platt Amendment, which is a very integral part of one of the amendments of the United States here back in 1901. And he fostered this in order to be able to set the standards of how we would control and operate in Cuba. William H. Taft, another president as well, also had dealings with this, as he was president when Orville H. Platt put this document, this amendment forth. And William McKinley, another Mason as well, who was later assassinated, but William McKinley also dealt heavily during the Spanish-American War. Now, another amendment that came out was the Teller Amendment, put forth by Henry M. Teller. Now, Henry M. Teller himself was a Freemason. He was a Sovereign Grand Inspector General of 33rd degree of the Scottish Rite. He was also the Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Colorado on 2 different occasions, 1863 and 1867. So there was no doubt he was a very active individual in the craft of Masonry. And he put forth an amendment as a joint resolution of the United States Congress enacted in 1898 in response to Willie McKinley's war message. And for the most part, what the Teller Amendment was that he wanted to give the people of Cuba their independence and avoid occupation once again by another foreign nation. Now, there is a little excerpt that I was able to find from Henry M. Teller, and it really smacks to how Freemasonry operates even today. We don't deal in politics, we don't deal in religion, and we actually believe that every man is equal upon the level, and that everyone has his due right in a lodge room. And he writes, "I never could do better now than when the American flag has come down from Cuba. But better still, a flag for Cuba has gone up. The American flag is the best flag in the world for Americans. It is not the best flag for men who do not want it. It is not the best flag for Cuba. Cuba's flag, not representing 100th part of the power and glory of our American flag here, is the flag for Cuba. And when the Philippines shall put up their flag, it shall come down as well. And I believe it will do so someday. It will be a better flag for them than ours can be, although many may administer in government with all the kindness and all the wisdom which human beings are capable. The best flag is the flag that men themselves put up. It is the only flag that ought to command the admiration and love and affection of the men who live under it. And it is the only flag that will. Liberty-loving men will never have any love for a flag that they do not create nor defend themselves. And that really smacks to how Masonry is, that regardless of where you come from, what jurisdiction you belong to, we are all independent Masons, believing in a single cause, that we're all created equal, that we all meet on the level, that we shouldn't be governed by any particular jurisdiction, or not any jurisdiction infringe upon another's jurisdiction. So he really, to me, it was a Mason speaking out on the beliefs and how Masons meet and how the world should meet and how we should treat our brethren in Cuba. Now, there is an interesting story with Willie McKinley, who played very big in this part before he was assassinated. But McKinley was a Civil War general, and he commanded a regiment from the infantry of Ohio. And he was visiting a Civil War Confederate prisoner of war camp. And he realized that many of them were sick and were injured. And he decided to ask his surgeon from his regiment to accompany him. And as they were going through this prison camp, the surgeon, from time to time, would actually bend down, shake a particular person's hand, cover his hand up, whisper in his ear. And on some occasions, he actually gave these individuals money. And Willie McKinley, being an astute, bright man, realized, what was this surgeon doing? I mean, there's no doubt about it that he couldn't have known these men, because these men were from opposing sides. They were from the South. And after they had done their visit of this camp, walking back to their regiment, McKinley asked the surgeon, he goes, I saw you doing, reaching down to some of these individuals. Some of these individuals, it seemed like you knew them personally. Some you gave money. You're whispering in their ear. He was intrigued by it. He asked them, he goes, what was the meaning of all this? He goes, well, they were brother Masons, and I was doing my job and my duty as a Mason to give them Masonic relief if possible. So they addressed me and extended to me a Masonic hand, and I extended back to them a Masonic response. I whispered friendly counsel in their ear. And after that, McKinley asked them, he goes, well, the money you gave out, do you expect to ever get it back? And he said, well, if they can pay it back, they will. If not, that's fine, because I gave what my cable toe allowed me to give without infringing on my own life and my own family. But that was my Masonic obligation and duty to give to a brother in need when he comes to me and shows me that he needs Masonic relief. And what intrigued McKinley was that even though these were enemies on opposing sides, how powerful can this organization be? How powerful is this fraternity be? That even though we were on opposing sides, that these two men can come together and share some fellowship, share some counsel, and help each other out, and still has something that, regardless what uniform they wore, that once a brother Mason asks or seeks Masonic relief, that is incumbent upon another brother Mason to give it, regardless whether or not he agrees with that individual or is on opposing side. And McKinley was so overwhelmed and impressed by this that he told his surgeon, if this is what it means to be a Freemason, then I want to slice it with myself. And he shortly after that became a Freemason, and he was probably one of the most ardent Freemason presidents we had. I mean, he really took it to heart. He was really dumbfounded by how this organization can transcend these borders and boundaries, even on a battlefield. Now, the biggest part that we come to is the dealings with the revolutionary period of the communist rise in Cuba. Now, this is very unique because Cuba is very particular interest to Masons, because Cuba is one of the few nations where Freemasonry was prescribed and has continued to operate even under communist regime or communist rule. We know in Eastern Bloc countries in Europe, in Russia, in Southeast Asia, in North Korea, this does not exist, and it has not existed, as was religion and many other organizations. But Freemasonry continued to, I'm not going to say flourish, because there were a lot of restrictions and hardships put on the people, but it survived all these years intact. They never went a year without a Grandmaster. They never went a year without a Grand Session. It might have been on the ground. It might have been just a handful of brethren, but they continued to work all the way through until this day today. And now they are just as big as they ever were before Castro. Now, the interesting story about it is why Castro did this. He comes to power and to rise in early 1953 when he attacks an army barracks in Santiago de Cuba on the eastern end of the island. This was a failed attempt. Most of the individuals and the insurrectionists were arrested. They were convicted and thrown into jail, including Castro. Not to mention that Castro came from a very wealthy family. He was a very wealthy elite, a plantation owner, a lot of money. And, he actually studies to be a lawyer. He's a very educated man. And he tries to overthrow the government of Cuba to impose a more modern, more realistic Cuba. He felt that Cuba was being swallowed up by nations around the world, in particular the United States and corporations and businesses, and that the people were suffering. Well, he's finally given his freedom about a year later. He seeks exile in Mexico, and there he plots for the next several years his return, which would be in 1959, when he once again landed on the shores of eastern Cuba in the Sierra Madre mountain range. And there he seeks to once again start this revolution to free this oppressive dominion. Now, again, he wasn't communist at that time. He wasn't leading as a communist leader. He was just trying to free the country of this dictatorial rule, which was oppressing his people, as had been done many, many decades before. Now, in the early onset of this second attempt revolution here, he is sent scrambling into the mountains for his life. Most of that first landing, most of his men were captured or caught again, and this insurrection was kind of quickly almost put down. And he narrowly escapes by the skin of his teeth, and he seeks refuge in a Masonic temple. Now, this is how the main story. There are many stories as to why Freemasons has survived in Cuba, but the biggest one that has been surfacing for many, many years is that the Masons in the Eastern Shores in the Masonic temple, as you see below, gave him safe haven and harborage until he can regather his strength and his forces and again, try again. So again, the rest is history. He gains momentum, and eventually in January 1959, he takes over the island of Cuba and he overthrows the government of Fulgencio Batista, who was probably no worse or no better than Castro. Was probably worse at the time because he was making deals with the mafia. He was making deals with other nations, lining his pockets up. He had a dictatorial rule where he declared himself president with no election. So again, he wasn't no better than what Castro was. And Castro was trying to liberate the people so that the people can have control of their own nation. Now, there are many other stories said that his close compadre, father, Angel, was a Mason. Some say that him and his brother secretly became Freemasons. It's not known. We don't know the truth. But the truth is that Masonry has survived in Cuba to this day during his regime. And it was always an unwritten rule where Castro never went after the Freemasons in Cuba. That is for sure 100% we know of. They didn't operate above ground. They weren't marching in parades. They weren't dedicating and consecrating temples and reconsecrating lodges or ceremonials. But for all intents and purposes, Castro's attitude towards Freemasonry is, if I don't see it and I don't know what's going on, so be it. But I'm not going after you. So continue what you're doing. I'm not going to. There was something there that kept him from going after these Freemasons. Now, Freemasonry in Cuba, again, has survived many centuries because of their resilience and the wars of occupation and countless wars of revolution, independence, imperial rule. But Cuba, Freemasons have always survived. And I must say that I believe that one of the reasons that Cuba has survived is what I believe is actually what makes more sense. Castro wasn't a stupid man. Castro was a very smart, educated man, and he knew history. And he knew that knowing history, if you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it. So he realized that going against the Masons would be a problem. And I believe in my heart that although he might have been saved by some Masons during those early years of 1959, when he tried to, once again, overthrow the government and found safe haven in a Masonic lodge, I believe that he realized that the history of Cuba, the forefathers of Cuba, all the founding leaders and heroic individuals who many died for the causes that they believed in, freedom from oppression, freedom from slavery, freedom from monarchical rule, they were all Freemasons. He realized that all of these leaders, all of these men, all of these conspiracies, all of these little skirmishes were all orchestrated, created, and organized by Freemasons. And he realized, what I would say is, being a smart man and an educated man and a student of history, he realized that every moment in the Cuban history from the early 1800s, every time there has been oppression, slavery, tyrannical rule, that Masons in Cuba have risen up and stood up against these causes and against these people who have tried to oppress or take away or enslave their people. And in the end, they won the day. And I believe that Castro realized that if I take away these Cuban leaders, if I take away their treasured past, their forefathers, their founding fathers, if I take away Masonry, these men will eventually conspire and come after me, because I can stop them from meeting, but I can't stop them from being Freemasons. And if you look at many communist countries, they rid themselves of the past. Stalin practically rewrote Russia, and all you would see were statues of Lenin and himself. So in North Korea, they completely rewrote the entire history, and you only see the statues of Kim Jong-il's himself, his father, and grandfather. That it seems like the world never existed beyond them. And Castro was the opposite. Castro said, I am not going to take away the most important democratic famous leaders who rose when the challenge was put forth to them to free their people and stand for their people. The people were inspired by these individuals. And I believe that he kept all these forefathers, all these famous martyrs and leaders. He kept them all in place, never replaced them, never talked bad about them, but actually celebrated them, was inspired by them, martyred them, and left Masonry alone, because he realized, to my perspective, he realized how influential, how powerful Masonry can be. And why would I go after a group of individuals who have, for 200 years, been fighting the same causes that I'm fighting for now? And everyone who has tried to put a stop them or bring some sort of oppression to this country, they are the ones that have lit that candle of liberty to try to free themselves. Why would I go against that? And instead, I think he used it for his own purposes. And Freemasonry has survived all that time in a communist-ruled country, not in the public, but now they are wide out in the public. They are marching again. They are performing ceremonies. They're performing dedications. They're performing, temple ceremonies. They're involved in the public. And just to give you an idea how influential and how important Masonry is to the people of Cuba, that when a Master Mason of a local community becomes a Master Mason, the small community or the town or the small cities or rural areas come out, and they have festivities, they have parades, they host with incredible fanfare and food to honor that brother who's just been elevated to Master Mason, because they realize how powerful, how these influential these men are. Looking at all their leaders, they realize that these men were Freemasons. They admire them so much that when a young man becomes a Master Mason, they come out in fanfare to honor and respect them for achieving that level and being allowed to become a Freemason, in the hopes of continuing to ensure the freedoms and democracies and the independence of the people of Cuba. Now, the one thing that stands out in all of Cuban history, Freemason, is that persecution, which began with the brethren there under the Spanish rule and their beliefs. Changes have been made that these brethren conspired against their government. Now, many people say, well, many of these revolution leaders conspired against the government. They conspired against their people. But again, did not many American brethren here conspired against the English government in the early history of America here? Do we condemn them for having so conspired? Washington, one of the chief conspirators, has become the father of our country, honored and respected because he stood loyal to an ideal. So should we condemn these early Cuban patriots for doing the same thing that many other leaders have done around the world? But fully express what Freemasonry represents to the Cuban people, suffice to say, without mentioning it once, twice, or perhaps 1,000 times, we cannot write the history of Cuban culture or Cuban struggle for freedom without Freemasonry itself. We should honor and remember those brave men of Cuba who, inspired by their Masonic beliefs of freedom and equality for all men, never strayed them from their ideals, and following in their paths of so many other revolutionary leaders and fellow Masons who fought for freedom and who carried their Masonic ideals in doing so. Now, brethren, just to give you another idea of how Castro did not bother the Masons, the Cuban Grand Lodge building, as I spoke before, is a very large building, was kept intact. Now, if any of you have seen the movie The Godfather, particularly The Godfather, I think it's Godfather 2, when Michael Corleone goes to Cuba and he finds himself in the midst of this Cuban Revolution, and many people in Cuba destroyed anything having connections with capitalism or Americanism here in the United States. They destroyed casinos, they destroyed the hotels. There was this big anti-American sentiment because of capitalism, because we were taking over their country, getting richer, and the poor would get poorer. But just to give you an insight on how powerful Masonry was, the Cuban Grand Lodge building was unscathed. It was not to be touched. It was never touched. It was never damaged. It was never in disrepair by these mob. And when you walk into this grand building, the foyer, you see these murals on the wall. Now, these murals date back way before the overthrow of the 1959 government with Castro. But all the leaders and faces you see here, the faces that are recognizable throughout the entire 150 odd so year until this portrait mural was drawn up and painted, all the faces you see there were actual Freemasons. Every single recognizable face in these two murals depicting many battles and many periods of the Cuban history of their people rising in times of oppression. All these legitimate faces here were Freemasons. And this mural has survived to this day intact, as you see here. They've never been spray painted, they've never been defaced or torn down. And again, they have survived this communist regime. Now, the Grand Lodge of Cuba today, they have a 3-year term, and Grandmaster Ernesto Zamora Fernandez will be stepping down this year in his term. And again, they operate on a 3-year term, and they're very active today. They travel and visit jurisdictions around the world, and particularly here in the United States. They travel to New Jersey and the United States here in New York quite a bit. The past Grandmaster before him, Lazaro Faustino Cuesta Valdez, also came to visit us during his reign. And if you see in the top left-hand corner, he is standing next to our future, what would be our future Grandmaster, Roger Quintana, who instituted multilingual languages here in the United States in New Jersey by chartering 4 Spanish lodges and a Portuguese lodge. The current Grandmaster did come to visit the Spanish lodges here and in New York, as well as the previous Grandmaster, who appealed when he gave a speech to the brethren that although the Masons in Cuba are steadfast, they're loyal, they are really standing behind, regardless of the struggles that they have. They really enjoy Freemasonry. They take it to heart. But many are suffering because they don't even have enough aprons for the brethren to wear in lodge. And usually the master or wardens are the only ones wearing aprons or even collars and jewels. Now, many of the brethren in Cuba attend lodges in whatever clothes that they might have, best clothes they might wear for the day. Many of them have shortages of decent clothing, like suits and tuxedos and jackets and ties, for instance. He came on to say, he goes, it makes me cry to think that my fellow Masons, one, don't have enough money, or two, can't get them hands on the proper attire to attend the meeting the way they really want to. So when he got done with his speech, I stood up and I took off my tie, my cufflinks, my tie clip, and I went, Grandmaster, it's used, but please take this and give it to a worthy brother who may need it so that he may enjoy proper attire and proper fellowship with the brethren as they so wish. And brethren, within minutes, the 150 or so brethren in that room were literally stripping down, removing their articles of clothing like ties and vests, and some gave their jacket. One guy gave his shoe. One brother gave his shoe. I don't know how he's going to get home because he said he took the subway. So it was really interesting how he was going to hobble on one foot all the way home, but he took his shoes off to give it to the Grandmaster to give. The Grandmaster literally had to purchase several suitcases to bring back the enormous contributions given to the brethren in ways of articles of clothing and jewels and Masonic aprons. And from time to time throughout the year, the Grand Lodge in New York and New Jersey, the brethren do send shipments of Masonic regalia and Masonic aprons down to their brethren in the hopes that they can all eventually enjoy a proper fellowship, a proper meeting, as we all do here and in Scotland. Now, one interesting thing I found when I went to Cuba in 2019 is that as I was walking through this museum and down this corridor, it's a really long corridor with the busts of many famous Masons. And it struck me odd that many of the busts that were there were representatives of famous Americans: Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, although not all of them were Masons. And it struck me there quite oddly. I'm saying to myself, Cuba and America were hated enemies. And yet this temple and these statues and these busts were not defaced, were not torn down, they were not broken. They're all standing where they have been for probably about 80 years. And it's amazing to see that during this time, that Freemasonry not only survived, but that was allowed not to be disturbed. At a time where anything American was completely erased from the history of Cuba or destroyed, that in this building, American artifacts, American statues of American Freemasons and famous Americans were left to stand and left alone and untouched. Again, owing to the power of Freemasonry and the influence that it's had on its people, saying that regardless, that may be American president, but he's a Freemason, we have to leave it alone. Let's not touch it. And again, the Grand Lodge building survived, where many other buildings were completely destroyed or torn down completely. Now, I did travel to Cuba, and I spent a few days there with my brother Victor on the left here, who speaks and writes English fluently. He actually came to visit me when I was coordinating a 33rd degree in New York several years ago. We've become very close friends, and we actually meet each other quite often. We haven't met last year because of COVID, but we do stay in contact all the time. We speak at least once a week. But I'd like to go over just some of the pictures that I was able to see. Here is the Grand Lodge building of the Grand Lodge of Cuba with the girl with a globe on top, the famous globe with the square and compass. That square and compass has withstood the test of time, and it has been there since the building was built. And not once was this mystical secret organization, that square and compass, was torn down. During the height of the revolutionary period in Cuba, during the height of the Cold War, this building was left alone. It was not touched, it was not destroyed, it was not vandalized, and the square and compass continues to fly uninterrupted since the building was built, giving you an idea of how powerful Freemasonry is in Cuba, that even the communists were scared to mess with these individuals and leave it alone. Now, this is the Grand Lodge office with many of the Grand Lodge secretary and the treasurer and many of the individuals that work in the office desperately and painstakingly putting their history back together again. They're trying to go over their records, which go back to the 1700s. They do have a lot of records which go back to Spanish dominion back into the 1600s as well. So they're trying to, I mean, it's in pretty bad shape. They're trying to put a concise history, write it all so they can create a volume of books so that the individuals in Cuba and Masons can enjoy the reading of their history, as well as the world. Now, the interesting part was that the building of Cuba has a huge outdoor deck roof where you can actually go out and see old Havana and the city of Havana. And you see here some panoramic pictures I took of Havana from the rooftop of this building, which gives you an incredible view. And like I said, at one point, it was the tallest building in Cuba. Now, the brethren in Cuba were eagerly and anxious, as the brethren in Scotland are, to host you, to facilitate your every need in Cuba, to make your stay a wonderful, fruitful stay. Now, this is the first time I went to visit the land of my birthplace of my parents. By this time, they had both my parents had deceased. But again, it was very touching for me to take this Masonic trip, but also to visit the land of my forefathers and my parents. Now, of course, everybody goes to the famous Floridita bar where Ernest Hemingway would sit there drinking his mojitos. And this is the birthplace of the famous drink, the daiquiri. And if you look at the bottom picture there is a life-size bronze statue of Ernest Hemingway, where he occupied that seat in that corner day in and day out as he drank himself sometimes into a stupor, but where he penned many of his greatest novels. They also took us to the home of Ernest Hemingway. They took us to the old cathedral, which is about 500 years old. They took us to the famous Bodeguita del Medio bar, which is a very high-end celebrity bar. Many celebrities around the world and famous people have visited here because you inscribe your name on the outside of the wall. It looks like graffiti, but there's tens of thousands of names that are just written over each other. And I left my team badger written there when I went. Now, when the brethren took me to the home of Ernest Hemingway, you can visit the home, but you can't enter. They open the doors, they open the windows, but you cannot actually enter the building. And I was trying to reach in to take some shots around the corners when one of the brothers came up to me and said, you want to take a better shot? I said, well, we're not allowed in. I'm just trying to stretch my arms to get the best shot I can. He goes, well, hold on, let me go inside. And he went inside and he spoke to somebody. And next thing I know, I was given a tour of the inside of Ernest Hemingway's home, and I was able to take pictures everywhere I want. You see there in the bottom picture, I'm inside the actual study of Ernest Hemingway, where he penned many of his most greatest novels in his actual home. So again, the incredible thing is that because Masonry is so well respected, that when Freemasons ask for favors or ask for something, it's usually granted. And apparently they knew someone in this building or knew a Mason in this building. And when they realized that there was a brother Mason that wanted to take pictures, they opened their arms and opened their doors freely, as all Masons there in Cuba do. In particular, with the fact that they had picked us up from the cruise ship and had us for 36 hours. And they rented the van and they took us everywhere we wanted to go on the island, there in Havana. Everywhere we wanted to stop, they stopped. They really catered to our every need. In particular, to the evening, our last evening there, we wanted to go see the famous Club Tropicana. Now, if you've ever seen the movie Goodfellas, and you see Ray Liotta is going into the nightclub and he goes to the kitchen, and Lorraine Bracco was wondering, why are we going to the kitchen? Well, because he's got a lot of clout. He's part of the mafia, and they're taken care of. And as soon as he gets there, they give it a table right in front of the stage, and everybody's thanking him and shaking their hands and sending them drinks because he was a made man. He was somebody important in the mafia. Well, I must say that there was 3 cruise ships docked that same time period, and of course, this is one of the highlights in the evening of Cuba. And of course, there's probably thousands of people trying to get into this club. And the brother here with the hat, Victor, decides to take us around the back, literally walking through the kitchen and through the loading docks. And the first thought that entered my mind was, I feel like the movie Goodfellas is I'm being taken through the kitchen, and they come out to this wide open outdoor auditorium. The people hadn't even begun to enter yet, the public. They sit us right in the front of the stage, in the front table. We're the only ones there. And they shower us with drinks and food, and the cigars were flowing like you wouldn't believe. They actually allowed us to come onto the stage and dance with the dancers at the end of the show. The brothers said, come on, they want us to come up and dance. And I'm like, okay, if you think it's okay. And I got to tell you, it was just a wonderful evening. Mind you that I was with a party of 9 Port Authority employees who all worked with me. So there wasn't a Masonic trip. It was special to me because I was meeting these brother Masons for the first time, and some of them for the first time in their own homeland. And it's just amazing how they opened their doors and allowed us to really enjoy ourselves. And on the last day, they told us that meet them out in the pier at 8:30 in the morning. And they had a surprise for us. And they rented 3 of the old cars from pre-Castro in the 50s. As you know, Cuba is known for their historic cars. It's kind of frozen in time in the 50s because they don't have the money to buy new cars. So they keep these beautiful cars from the 40s and 50s in pristine condition. And they rented 3 taxis. And the They also rented the oldest registered taxi in Havana, a 1921 Ford convertible, which me and my nephew, also smoking cigars, decided to take. And I told my wife, I said, this one's for me and my nephew. Sorry, you're gonna have to go in the back car. But that was a great surprise. It was a beautiful day. We toured for 4 hours up and down the streets of Havana, smoking cigars, going to the famous Havana club, the famous rum from Havana, seeing all the wonderful sights again, live in person. And again, it was just a thrill that they'd actually set this all up for us here and for us to enjoy on my last day in Cuba. Brother, but one thing I must say to all this, and why I present this, is because Freemasonry is very unique. Freemasonry is a perfect institution made up of imperfect men. Freemasonry gives you the tools, the implements, it gives you the allegories, the stories. It molds you and hopes that you take the lessons from Freemasonry and do good with it among the world. Now, of course, not all Freemasons are perfect. We still have bias, we still have racism, we still have bigotry, we still have atrocities that happen around the world. But bottom line is that Freemasonry has been around for centuries, and at every corner, whether it was an oppression, whether it was apartheid, whether it was slavery, whether it was a dictatorial or monarchical rule, Freemasonry has always been there behind the scenes working to ensure the freedoms and democracies for all peoples. Now, here in New Jersey, when we close lodge, the master gives a master's charge. And there's a small part that says, every person has a claim upon your kind offerings. Do good unto all, especially those who are the household of faith. Now, why would the master charge this? This is an organization, a secret organization. It's a brotherhood. We're Freemasons. So why would the master give this charge, not to take care of each other, not to do good for each other, but that every human being has a claim upon your kind offerings, that we should do good unto all peoples. And I believe this speaks to why and the important and the core values of our fraternity. Our fraternity is a wonderful, unique organization that allows men to meet in fellowship, regardless of the color of your skin, regardless of the God you preach or profess to, regardless of your culture, your creed, your tongue, your nation. We all don't come in the same way and manner, brethren, but we are linked by this mystic tie, this brotherhood that we have all gone through at one point or another that makes us who we are today as Freemasons. Now, our fraternity is made up of imperfect men, but our fraternity allows us to disagree with each other. It allows us to even not like each other sometimes, but at the end of the day, we must respect each other as men. And regardless whether you're a noble or a king or a prince or a potentate or a beggar, when we enter the lodge, we enter as men, meeting on the level and equal, and we leave the profane world outside. And I think that's the most important, influential part that Masonry has. And I guess for centuries, why kings and queens and potentates and dictators and nations and religions have feared us. Because there is no place on earth where men can meet together in harmony, with respect for one another, and allow to discuss differences amicably and peacefully, and yet never breaking that chain of union at the end of the meeting. And that really smacks to the heart and core of Freemasonry and who we are. And that's what I hope that you take with you today, of how important Freemasonry is, in particular in the world today, as we see a lot of the upheavals here in the United States. We see a lot of the upheavals in the Middle East. And it's a shame that the world doesn't take a slice of how Freemasons act and conduct themselves when in lodge, and that it can work. If it can work in a lodge, it can work in the world. And that's what I hope, the message that I convey, that regardless of this communist regime, Freemasons were always there. They have always been there, and they will always continue to be there whenever the call comes. And many have said, Brother Mo, shouldn't Masons stay away from politics and religion discussions and interactions? And I say yes. But when the peace and harmony of a lodge is disturbed, it is incumbent upon every Mason to stand up and whisper friendly counsel and advice to the brother who's disturbing that peace and harmony of the lodge. So it is incumbent upon every Mason, when the peace and harmony of their community, of their nation, of their government has been disturbed or in upheaval, it is incumbent upon every Mason to stand up and whisper those friendly counsel advice and stand up for those who can't stand up for themselves. And that's really the message that I hope that you'll take with you here, how important our fraternity is that it's not about awards and titles and pomp and circumstance, but it is about doing what is right all the time. And keep in mind how many brethren have given up and paid that ultimate sacrifice so that we can meet here today as freemen and Freemasons. So brethren, may God bless all of you. May God bless Scotland. May God bless all our veterans, past and present, all our first responders and healthcare workers, because it is by their sacrifice that we meet here today as freemen and Freemasons. And may God continue to shine his blessings on the greatest fraternity in the world, Freemasonry. Thank you, brethren.
Brother Moses Gomez, you've humbled me with this presentation this evening, taking us on a remarkable journey through the country of your forebears and showing that light of Masonry that has been there for 200 years through, as you said, so much challenging times through until today. And Moses, we know from your other presentations that you've lived those words that you've stated this evening. And sir, you're a great credit to your lodge and to your Grand Lodge. And it's been a pleasure here to welcome you once again on behalf of all the guests and members of Lodge Hope of Karachi. And I thank you, sir, for your presentation. It was very, very interesting. We do have some questions, Mo. If you've
Sure.
got a few minutes to answer them for us, that would be great. One of our brethren who's joining us from Paris noticed in the picture of the Masonic home Lasso, there are a couple of ashlars at the entrance gate. Do they have Masonic significance? They look like pierres cubiques in French lodges.
No, I don't know if they have any. But I would love to find out and inquire about that. I know this. There's a lot of significance, Masonic overtones within the compound itself, but I don't know the significance of those two stones. But I'm glad he brought it out because I will definitely inquire about that, and hopefully add it into my my next presentation if it does mean something in particular.
Okay, thank you, Moses. Brother Ian Kennedy asks, was there any tension with the lodges in the wake of the Bay of Pigs?
Well, lodges suffered a lot. I'm working on adding that part of the era of Bay of Pigs in there because there was a lot of, from what I'm getting, there's hints that there was Masonic intervention in that Bay of Pigs, which actually turned out to be a disaster because it was involved with the CIA backing, Cuban rebels who were fighting against, but then kind of abandoned them. So that's another ugly part of that battle between America and Cuba. But there are many that say that many Freemasons were once again involved in that, into trying to overthrow Castro, because once he went from freeing them from the dictator Fulgencio Batista and then became a communist dictator, that didn't sit well with them, and many said, well, you know what, then you're just no better than the Spanish were, and you got to go too. But again, that's something that I'm working out. But the little bit of history that I've done, there seems to have been some Masonic involvement in the Bay of Pigs as well, with Masons being involved as well, as they've been involved in many other skirmishes throughout their 200-year history. But again, lodges suffered a lot, not because of the regime, but because of the lack of funds, because of lack of money. They couldn't afford to maintain these buildings. They couldn't afford to fix them. So again, over the years, many lodges have suffered. They're still suffering today, but they're making great strides again. But that, every lodge did suffer back then, and many were meeting in the basement of a brother's home. Many of the buildings were taken over by the communist government. Many just fell in disrepair. They didn't have the money or the means to maintain these buildings, to adequately maintain them. So, there's no doubt about it that Masonry did struggle, but it survived, which is incredible. In a communist country, it did survive. Yeah,
we've got a lovely comment from Claudio Inesco. Outstanding presentation regarding Freemasonry in Cuba. I met several times Most Worshipful Brother Lazario Cuesta Valdez, past Grandmaster of Cuba. You reintroduced me in the atmosphere of Cuban Masonic life. Thank you so much, Moses.
Thank you, brother.
A wonderful lecture regarding Freemasonry in Cuba. I hope one day to go to Cuba and take part in a meeting. Excellent lecture. Masons in Newfoundland have donated regalia to Cuba as well. Excellent presentation. Great talk, Moses. Any chance of hearing the Cuban national anthem? Well, Michael, I'll find it on YouTube and I'll put it up on the Facebook later on this evening so everyone can hear that. Thank you, Moises. Well done, Mo. Thoroughly enjoyable once again. And again, from Brother George at Lodge 413 in 1848. Thank you, Brother Moises, for your excellent presentation this evening. And your heartfelt thoughts and feelings you shared. Again, thank you. Masterclass in speaking. Sandy Thompson asks, Russia had bases in Cuba. How did they react to Freemasonry?
Well, they didn't participate from what I've gathered. I mean, Russia has never played a part in it, and Russian soldiers never played a part in it. But Russia, I've never seen an instance of Russian lodges. Now they seem to once again have a relationship with Russia's Russian Grand Lodges up and running again and flourishing. But I guess because it was wiped away in Russia and you couldn't have it, I guess many of that generation that grew up without Freemasonry didn't know much about it, didn't want to inquire. So there was that big gap of years where Masonry wasn't around when these young men were growing up. So they had nothing to aspire and to look forward to, and their elders couldn't speak about it. So it transpired again in Cuba, but I've never heard of famous Russians or Russian soldiers actually participating in Cuban lodges. Again, there was also the fear that, people were trying to intervene. There was always rumors that the communists would implant brethren to join in these lodges, and there would be ears and keep an ear out for what's going on, make sure there was no seditious acts or rebellious acts going on. And that was, again, it just goes to show you the fear that Castro and many of these people had. I mean, you're talking about a communist country with Russia as their number one supporter and backer, a powerful country, but yet they could be scared of such a small organization or fearing it because they realize that, although we're going to let them operate, let's just keep our ears to the ground and make sure that the seeds of rebellion aren't stirring in these, because if it's going to happen, it's going to happen in Masonic lodges first. So that's where they would concentrate. I've had many brothers who were in exile, much older now, and left in exile in Cuba, and said that they from time to time there would be brethren who they were suspicious of that were probably planted by the government to see what's going on, to hear what was going on. I was also told that minutes of these meetings, even during communist time, had to be sent to some sort of department, communist department in Cuba, so that they can review the minutes and see what was going on and make sure that there was no upheaval. And I guess the Cuban government felt if there was going to be any issues of rebellion or upheaval, it was going to start at the Masonic lodges first. And if we can quell it first here over here, maybe we can settle this before it becomes a virus and spreads throughout the country as it's done in centuries before. So it really gives you an idea of how influential Masonry can be when it's used for the proper purposes of its people and its members for liberty and independence and freedom for all, as all men should meet on the level as we're all created equal. So that's really it's really inspiring to see that Masons can be such a formidable power amongst this massive power, which was head to head with the United States, and yet these small group of Masons in Cuba were the sort of always, let's let them do what they got to do. We're not going to oppress them, but let's just keep an ear on them, because if it's going to start somewhere, it's going to start there. We got to make sure we quell this fast, not by stomping them, but by finding out why they are uprising, why are they upset. Maybe we'll let them do this. Maybe we'll let them have a ceremony. Maybe we'll just give them a little bit more freedom, but let's keep them quiet. Let's appease them, because if they're happy, we're happy. We can keep running our show here the way we are. And that's very impressive to see that Masons could actually have that kind of power when it's used for good.
Yeah, Moises, thank you so much. Just as a small aside, Moises, just as the questions come to end, I'm pulling together a presentation as a backup presentation for this lockdown lecture series, and I'm doing one on the Masonic presidents out of this book by Randall Rogers. And last night I was doing about McKinley and that story that you told about the money and the hospital and the soldiers on either side. So very interesting from what I'm doing just now myself. Moises, once again, thank you on behalf of everyone here at the Lodge Hope of Karachi for coming along and giving us that presentation. I think it was very interesting and very much appreciated, as the comments testify to. And just before I ask the Brethren to unmute themselves and give you their personal thank yous. Can I give notice that next week, Brethren, we will have Brother Scott Watson, one of our own from one of the islands out in Argyll and Isles, coming to talk about his passion, art and Masonry, and he talks about the art in our tracing boards, Brethren. I've seen this presentation, and Scott Watson's he's a younger Scottish Freemason, so it'd be really good to give him some encouragement, because he is really getting involved in researching his own material, so it will be unique, Brethren. So please come along next Tuesday. At this time, please unmute yourselves, Brethren, and say your thank yous and your good nights. Moises, thank you, sir.
My pleasure, dear brother. Anytime.
Thank you, Brother Moses, from 413 in 1848.
Thank you, brother.
All the best.
Thank you, Brother Moses. Superb again.
As always, superb.
Moses, excellent presentation, Master.
Thank you, Brother Moses, for a wonderful presentation.
Thanks, Brother Moses. Really enjoyed that. Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you, Brother Moses. I will concur with all the other speakers.
Thank you, Brother Moses. Nice to see you again. Well, enjoy it again.
Thank you, brethren. Thank you once again. Have a wonderful evening. Stay safe. And hopefully, God willing, we can meet next year in fellowship in person, as I would love to definitely meet you live in person, either to present or just have some fellowship.
No, we'd love to have you in Rosyth, Moses, the next time you're over. Brethren, with that, I'll finish the recording, and thank you all for coming along.